About 3 years ago, I released my first video game, Yamasen-chan's Hermit Home Designer, a hikikomori designing game. In it, you help a socially anxious shut-in, Yamasen-chan, design her hermit home in a story that gets progressively darker. Well, technically, the first game I released was actually Dog Sitting Simulator for the Pico 8, but that doesn't count because it was made on my first day of learning to code. The first game I actually put effort into was Hermit Home Designer, and to my surprise, it was a success. I went into the project fully expecting that I would put months of work into a game, just for it to be released with absolutely no attention or players. And that is what happened at first, but then slowly but surely, the game gained traction on itch.io organically. I had 0 followers on social media and no means of marketing the game, so all of the attention it did get was organic. It got major download boosts thanks to Let's Play channels Manly Badass Hero and Lauren Z Side, and every time I saw someone do a video on the game, there would be a noticeable conversion to the game's page. The game was free, but I even made a few $100s in donations. That's still not enough to make the game profitable, but I did manage to use that money to put up a Steam page for the game. Across Steam and itch.io, Hermit Home Designer has close to 20,000 downloads, which is enough to know that every day, at least a few people are playing the thing that I created. And then I made my second game, which completely flopped. Negentropic Wondering is my second game, which has basically no downloads except for the few people I sent it to for feedback. I knew it wouldn't be as successful as my previous game because of its more abstract theming, but to not get a single organic download was demoralizing. Again, I had no means of marketing and no social media following for promotion. So now months after its release, it just sits on a dormant itch page teasing me with the absurdity of having made it at all. I wanted to make another game, but I didn't want this to happen again. If I'm going to dedicate my time and resources into game development, I need to make something people will actually want to play and has a chance of finding its audience. So when I sat down to start a new project a couple of months ago, I decided to make something in the same style as Hermit Home Designer. This would hopefully make the game appealing to the same audience that played in my first game. Comparing the two games I've released, Hermit Home Designer is cute, cozy, anime, and has a dark sense of humor. In contrast, Negentropic Wondering is dark, bleak, and has a name that no one can understand. I knew that whatever game I made, it should lean into that former style. I flirted around with the idea of just doing a sequel, but I quickly scrapped that idea. I knew I wanted to do something bigger than Hermit Home Designer, but still manageable to do on my own. I also didn't have a good enough idea for a return into the world of Hermit Home Designer. One thing I knew I had to do with the new game is, well, actually make it a game. You see, Hermit Home Designer doesn't technically count as a game at all. There are no goals or constraints in the game that would actually make it a game. Instead, the game is based entirely on intrinsic motivation to design homes and enjoy the story. You can speedrun the game by going through the 6 levels by only placing one random piece of furniture in the level and clicking the finish button. The game even has a finish button just sitting in the corner when the player just feels like moving on. While I love the anti-game game nature of Hermit Home Designer, I knew I had to challenge myself this time to make a game proper, with goals and strategic constraints. How am I going to become a good game designer unless I design actual game? Nonetheless, I love intrinsically driven games, and the game I make will primarily focus on that. So I jumped right into prototyping with no clue what I would make. What I first came up with was a panel of words that you could click through and a stress stat in the corner of the screen that reacted to the words you clicked on. This is hardly a game, but it initialized some of the ideas forming around my new game. I liked selecting words, but doing so needed more context and motivation. Initially, I was considering a conversational or introspective theme, where the player would choose words that affect the player's day. The problem with this design is that the stat information is baked into the words artificially by me, and the game becomes about memorizing what words have what stat effects. I preferred a game about feeling out words rather than memorizing them. I realized that a similar mechanic is present in the game Doki Doki Literature Club, where the player chooses poem words that affect how the girl characters react to the player in-game. This system was similar to mine, but worked far better, mainly because there are multiple girls to aim for, which makes the word selection fun. You have to intuit which words fit which girl's personality rather than memorizing the artificially best words. I also like how in Doki Doki Literature Club, there is no right answer to the word game. It is purely enjoyable because of the attachment the player has to the characters they are trying to pick for. It was around this time that I settled on the idea of making the game into a dating simulator. This would provide context for the word game and for the stats. The player could manage their time by choosing what to do during the day to affect their stats, and do the word game during dates with girls to gain affection. With this plan in mind, I started a new Unity project and started from scratch. I made a stats panel with 8 stats, a date and time display with a morning and evening state, an activity panel with buttons to do time actions, and I imported Yarn Spinner for dialogue. Yarn Spinner is an extremely useful tool for dialogue control in Unity Project. It's way better than the dialogue system I was able to code for Hermit Home Designer. With Yarn Spinner imported, you can make a .yarn file, and in that, you create nodes of text that can jump from one to another using the jump command. You can set variables, call methods, and use if statements for flow control. To call a method in Yarn, all I had to do was create a method in my persistent scene director script, and then call dialogue_runner.add command handler with that method's name. And then I can easily call that method in the dialogue by adding it between the less than and greater than signs. If statements are also extremely useful, like in this dialogue script, for checking the date girl variable and the date location variable to determine which node to run during a date. At this point in the game, the player could take classes, go out, work, or rest in exchange for a unit of time. Classes increase your stats, going out allows you to buy gifts, working increases your money, and resting decreases your stress. While the game isn't necessarily fun yet, I think there is something to be said about the very simple pleasure of clicking a button and seeing numbers go up. It was here that I added the ability to encounter girls, and for that I needed to design the girls. I initially wanted to keep the scope of the game in check, and have only about 7 girls in pixel art style, but the scope quickly increased to 12 girls in a high resolution style. I decided to abandon the pixel art style because I wasn't getting results I was happy with in my initial drafting stage, and because I had concerns for the overall game if it was to be pixelated. A dating sim involves a lot of reading, and pixel graphics are not conducive to easy reading. I could have a mixed art style with non-pixelated UI, and some games do that well, but I personally prefer the consistency of a fully pixelated or fully non-pixelated style. So I took a few of my pixel art designs that I liked, and upscaled them. I did all the art in Clip Studio, which is my preferred software for anything that involves drawing. At this stage, I wasn't worried about getting the designs perfect, but just wanted drafts that looked good enough to convey what the final game may look like. This is something I do a lot with my games, which is to make drafts of assets as I go, and then wait until the project is nearing completion to go back through those drafts and finish them. Making the game requires a scaffolding that incrementally improves the game. If I just did one aspect of the game early on to completion, I wouldn't have a vertical slice of content that better shows off what the game is. One thing I maintained from the early pixel art stage was the 4:3 aspect ratio, which suits this game well because with a widescreen display there's a lot of blank space on the sides where the characters aren't placed. Moving the number of girls to 12 was a hard decision because the way the game is structured, more girls means more locations, activities, and writing. I was not looking forward to drawing 12 distinct background locations for each of the girls, but it had to be done. But drawing backgrounds is hard and time consuming, and I have to keep the scope of the game in check somehow. So I cheated. At first I tried using AI to generate backgrounds, but I had no luck there. The images that generated had weird features, and didn't match the drawing style I had chosen for the girls. So instead I resorted to tracing. I found free stock photos on Pexels and Unsplash for the date locations, and simply traced them in the desired style. I do admit that the backgrounds could have been more lively and less generic if I had made them from scratch, but I had to save time somehow. I made a bedroom, a conservatory, a cafe, a bookstore, a movie theater, and a school building. Again, I just made unpolished drafts that are complete enough to give me a sense of what the final game will look like. With the visual identity of the game coming together, it was time to do a first pass at the game's UI. I knew I wanted the game's UI to look similar to Hermit Home Designer, so I imported some of those assets as placeholders. I also imported Hermit Home Designer's music as placeholders. The main UI features yellow panels with moving white stripes, while the dialogue UI is pink with moving dots. In the first draft of the UI, the stats panel and the time panel were put together in this long strip that covered the whole width of the canvas. This coupled with the bottom panel made the game too claustrophobic, so I switched the stat panel to have rounded corners and placed the time panel below it. The colors at this point were intended to have a pastel effect, but were really just washed out. I fixed this by using Google's material design palette for UI. I also made a simple calendar. I added the functionality of calling and asking out girls on dates. Calling takes up an entire time slot, and girls can reject the player. When going out on dates, the player can play the word selecting game from before, but now trying to pick conversation topics that will impress their date. The player can also give gifts to their date, or gossip about the town to learn new date locations. At this point, it was time to start on the music. For the game, I was going to need 12 girl themes along with 4 gameplay themes for each season and a few miscellaneous tracks. I do all my music in Reaper, which I've been using since I was in high school recording my first songs. All the songs in the game are relatively simple loops that fit within the pacing of the game. Some of the free plugins I like to use include Shreddage 3 Stratus for guitar, Spitfire's BBC Symphony Orchestra for orchestral instruments, and Spitfire's Labs for miscellaneous instruments. The selection of free sounds available from Spitfire is incredible. In the songs for the game, I use a lot of Labs percussion kit and Peel guitar. On the paid side, I use a lot of a Rickenbacker bass plugin, Spitfire's felt tip piano, and Sessions guitarist strummed acoustic for acoustic guitar. With the assets for the game coming together, it was time to address a difficult question. Is the game fun? And the answer was no. The main culprit was the time system. I originally wanted there to be 2 time slots per day, one for morning and one for evening. That way the player would have a realistic college schedule where they choose to go to college in the morning and do an activity in the evening. But this setup raised some problems. The first is that time moved way too slowly. It takes multiple button presses to perform some of the actions available to the player, and doing this for every time slot was tedious. Additionally, having a college activity that is mandatory on weekdays lessens the strategy of choosing which classes to partake in, so I scrapped the multiple times a day in favor of a single action per day. I also made an automation system where the player chooses an action on Monday that gets automatically chosen every day until the weekend. This also has the benefit of putting restrictions on how the player changes their stats so that it's harder to upgrade them evenly. I also limited going out to the weekends so that the process of selecting between 12 locations would appear less often and so that a greater stat boost could be selected on weekdays. I also limited going out to the weekends so that the process of selecting between 12 locations would appear less often and so that a greater stat boost could be selected on weekends. This also means that if the player decides to call a girl, which can only be done on weekends, they're missing out on getting stat boosts. These changes went a long way to make the game feel more fun and fast-paced. As the game was coming together, I realized that more and more it started to feel like the game Tokimeki Memorial. The game shares the same core structure as Tokimeki Memorial. This comparison was a good thing though, because it helped me to further define and refine the game with reference. Tokimeki Memorial also has the player choose between school activities to fill time slots for stat boosts, but it doesn't allow the player to choose which options are available to them. This is something I wanted to improve upon with my game, so I made the player choose 4 of 8 classes every semester and 1 of 4 clubs every year. This way the player can strategize or roleplay their desired choices, and the decisions they make will affect which girls they encounter. This also adds replayability to the game because not every girl can be met in a single playthrough. All of these activities need animations. Unlike Tokimeki Memorial, which uses a deformed style of the player to depict activities, I decided to make the player character completely invisible for the game. I think this will help with identifying with the character as yourself. I opted to use vectors to make these graphics in Adobe Illustrator instead of Clip Studio. I tried out the new AI text-to-vector graphic in Illustrator and got mixed results. I used a few AI generations as reference for colors and composition, but besides that, made them on my own. I am a graphic designer, so making vector art feels right at home. Again, I only made drafts of all the graphics and will tidy them up at a later date. The most challenging part of the whole game making process is the script writing. I have plenty of experience making art and music, but fiction writing not so much. I spent days just on writing, and while there isn't much I can show in a devlog, I've tried my best to make every character feel distinct and unique in personality and voice. The game in its current state has drafts for most of the art and music, and the core game loop programmed and well defined. Now that the form of the game is established, it's time to start working more on the content side of the game. This means writing primarily. In the final game, the player will be able to experience a story, date girls, play mini games, and experience holidays and events with their dates. I gave the game the title Love MO1, which is based on how the community college I went to named their classes, and how the classes in the game are named. The Steam page for the game is live, so if this project interests you, give it a wishlist, subscribe for more updates, and follow my X for Screenshot Saturday posts. This has been Ryan9, thank you for watching.